Hello, and welcome to the show, Why Can't You Cook? I'm your host, Frederick McFrenchfries, and my job is to take the world's most inept cooks and turn them into cooking superstars. For today's show, we have our contestant, Keith. Come on in, Keith.
Hello.
Now, Keith, let us look and see what everyone has to say about you. Now remember, folks, just post your stories on Twitter and we'll at hashtag Why Can't You Cook, and we will see what you have to say. Now, let's take a look. Ooh, caught himself on fire while making PB&Js. Well, isn't that a hot mess right there? Oh, and another one. Melted 6 spatulas while scooping ice cream. Oh, that just gives me the chills. What do you have to say about yourself, Keith?
Please help me.
Luckily for you, Keith, it is our job to help people like you and reduce the number of hazards in the world.
Hey.
Well, let's get down to the basics. I'm kind of parched. Bring me a glass of ice water. What are you doing?
Water.
That's boiling water.
So?
You obviously do not know the basics of thermodynamics. Here, let our professor teach you about thermodynamics, starting with enthalpy.
You're trying to raise the temperature of the water when you should be trying to lower it. See, what most people don't know is that temperature and heat are two different things. Temperature is a physical property of matter, where heat, represented by Q, is the change in energy due to a difference in temperature between the internal and external environments. When energy is absorbed by a system, you have a positive delta, you have a positive change in Q, and it's an endothermic reaction. When you release heat, it's a negative Q value, and you have an endothermic reaction. So delta H represents the enthalpy. And enthalpy for a reaction that is occurring at a constant pressure is going to be the same sign as the Q value. So to calculate the change in enthalpy, you do the sum of the enthalpies of formation, which can be found in a table, of the products minus the enthalpies of formation of the reactants. So in your refrigerator, you have an exothermic reaction going on. The water inside is giving off heat, which is being absorbed by the back of the refrigerator, which is why it experiences an increase in temperature and it feels so hot, whereas the inside feels really cold.
Now that you know the basics of enthalpy, try and give me a glass of ice water again.
Okay. Ice water.
Ah, refreshing. Now you have just leveled up from a cooking hazard to a culinary imbecile. Well, Keith, now that you know how to do something basic like giving me a glass of water, let's get to something a little more complex. Let's have you make some funfetti cake.
Okay. Wait a minute. How did this get so messy?
Well, Keith, that has to deal with a concept called entropy.
I thought we already learned about enthalpy.
Not enthalpy, Keith. Entropy. Here, let our professor explain.
The room progressively getting messier is an example of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy will always increase for a spontaneous process. So let's break this definition down. A spontaneous process is one that occurs by itself, without the need for energy to be put in. And non-spontaneous processes are ones in which energy needs to be put in for the reaction to happen. An example of these can be seen in your typical baking soda volcano, in which acetic acid is added to sodium bicarbonate and to form these products. And this reaction happens by itself as soon as the reactants come into contact, without the need for energy to be put in from the outside. So the next part of the definition was entropy, which is defined as the amount of randomness in a system. So a negative value of delta S indicates that a reaction goes toward more ordered state, and a positive value indicates a more disordered state. It's calculated in a similar way to delta H, in which you can take the products minus the reactants, and these values can typically be found in a table. And then M and N stand for the coefficients. But there are a couple ways you can tell whether a reaction is going to have a positive or negative delta S value. One is if the reaction goes toward more products, as in a dissolving reaction in which one thing will break up into multiple pieces. Another way you can tell is if it goes to form more moles of gas, like in combustion, where you get CO2 and water vapor as products. And the third way you can tell is if the reaction goes from a more ordered to a less ordered phase, like a liquid to a gas.
Okay, so this is interesting and all, but what does this have to do with cooking?
Well, by themselves, they only make up part of the whole. But together, they make up our most important lesson, determining whether a reaction is spontaneous or not.
So what does entropy and enthalpy have anything to do with being spontaneous?
Here, let our professor explain.
When we relate enthalpy and entropy, we get a concept called Gibbs free energy. It's a way of determining the energy state of a reaction. If a reaction has a negative delta G value, then it means it gives off energy and is going to be spontaneous. If it has a positive delta G value, then it's non-spontaneous and needs energy to be taken in to happen. And if a delta G value is 0, then that means that the reaction is in perfect energetic equilibrium. So one way we can calculate the delta G is with this equation, which is the same one that we used for delta S and delta H. And these delta G of formation values are typically given in a table the same way as delta H and delta S. So the other main way that we calculate the energy change is with this equation, which relates the enthalpy and entropy to a change in temperature. And so you just plug in these values from a chart with the new temperature for the reaction, and then I'll give you the spontaneity. There are a couple things to bear in mind when you're using this equation. Watch your units. Delta S is typically given in joules per mole Kelvin, whereas delta H and delta G are typically measured in kilojoules. Another thing to keep in mind is that this naught value is only indicatory of a 1 atmosphere of pressure, so if your pressure is not remaining constant, then you can't use this equation. And the other thing that you need to bear in mind is that if you have a phase change in your reaction, you cannot use this equation because the delta S value will change too drastically. This chart can be used to determine spontaneity for different enthalpy and entropy values. If you have different signs, then the reaction is going to be the same at all temperatures. But if your signs are the same, then you have to take into account the temperature because this affects how much entropy is going to change. So your delta G value is also equal to your work max. And this is for an ideal engine, of course, because some of the energy will be lost, increasing the entropy of the environment. So this means that for a Carnot engine, you can either use the physics equations pictured here, or you can calculate the delta G values for each of the reactions and sum them to get the total work of the engine. So reactions can also be coupled to make a very non-spontaneous reaction occur by itself, which is very important in industry. If you take a reaction with a very positive delta G value and combine it with a negative delta G reaction, you can get an overall negative delta G reaction that occurs spontaneously. You know all about spontaneity, you are ready to take your next step in the culinary journey.
Now that you know the basics of thermodynamics, it's time for your final test. We're going to have you make a common dish, Jello.
Jello. I think I can do this. Shouldn't be too hard. Okay. Okay, so judging from this, I'm going to have to put some hot water in it so that it has enough activation energy to begin the process. So, judging from this, I know that there is a negative enthalpy value and a negative entropy value because it goes from a powder to a jiggly solid. So, with both negative values, I'm probably going to have to put this in the refrigerator. I'm going to have to lower the temperature so the negative enthalpy value will overcome the entropy value, meaning that there's a negative delta G value, which the free energy equation will tell us means that it's spontaneous. I'm going to have to put this into a solid state from the liquid state, making it more ordered, which will give us the jiggly solid that we know and love as Jello.
Well, Keith, you did it. You actually were able to make Jello.
Thank goodness.
You have now officially gone from the very beginning level as cooking hazard to the final level, cooking all-star.
Yes.
Join us next week when we have our next guest, Ken Kemmer. Thank you. Good night.
You can